Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Visual Voices Lecture Series, hosted by the School of Art at George Mason University. My name is Jeffrey Kenny. I'm Associate Curator with Mason Exhibitions. I'd like to start tonight by acknowledging the Monacan Nation, including the Manahoac people, the traditional owners of the land and waters upon which George Mason University stands. In addition, on behalf of the School of Art community, I affirm our commitment to anti-racism, social justice, and creating a culture of excellence, inclusion, and accessibility. We'll have a Q&A session following tonight's lecture, so we ask that you save your questions for the artist until the end. If you would like to ask a question at that point, please do so by raising your hand using the raise hand feature, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and by pressing the reactions button, followed by the raised hand button. Once called upon, you may then unmute yourself and ask questions directly to the artist. Tonight's lecture will be recorded. It will be made available for view roughly 1 week from today on the School of Art website and on our Mason Exhibitions website. During the presentation, you may keep your video on, but we please ask that you keep your microphones on mute. Now, I am very excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Dario Robleto. Robleto is a transdisciplinary artist, citizen scientist, researcher, writer, and teacher. Tapping into multiple creative traditions ranging from astrophysics to paleontology to poetry to DJ culture, his work has focused with particular intensity on theories and practices of recording and on the material and emotional structures of intergenerational relay and memory. His work has been profiled in numerous publications, including NPR's Radio Lab and Krista Tippett's On Being. He has been an artist in residence and scholar at institutions such as the Smithsonian Museum of American History and the Ratcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. In 2015, he joined a distinguished team of scientists as the artistic consultant to Breakthrough Message, a multinational effort that aims to encourage intellectual and technical debate about how and what to communicate if the current search for intelligent life beyond Earth is successful. In 2016, he was appointed as the Texas State Artist Laureate. And in 2020, he was a research consultant to the popular science television series Cosmos: Possible Worlds, which aired on the Nat Geo channel and Fox. He's currently serving as artist at large at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and the Block Museum of Art. And he's working on his first book, Life Signs: The Tender Science of the Pulse Wave, published through the University of Chicago Press and co-authored with Harvard art historian Jennifer Roberts. So now please join me in welcoming Dario Robleto.
Wow. Good evening, everybody. Jeffrey, thanks for that great introduction. I'm really excited to talk to you. I've never had the pleasure of visiting your school. I hope one day I can actually be there in person. One thing I really miss is the interaction with students in their studios. So hopefully one day, maybe I'll get invited back. But tonight I'm going to jump in. That was a great intro. Thank you. I'm going to let that do its job, and I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to try to be a little ambitious with what I'm talking about tonight. So tonight, what I'd really like to highlight about my practice, and that I hope is relevant to all the young artists out there, and it's really the backbone to everything that I do, which is to ask questions, and I really mean a lot of questions, which I think will become evident tonight. And you know, this is something, of course, we all ask questions. I'm sure several people have asked several today. But what I really want to get at, though, is what is it about the way artists ask questions that, we could argue kind of sets us apart a bit, that it almost forms its own type of inquiry. And so my own practice, I tend to ask a lot of questions. They're very uneasy questions. Perhaps they don't have an even identifiable answer. And further, they tend to be questions that it's not entirely clear why artists should be asking those questions at all. And certainly seems unclear that we could offer a good answer to them. But I believe that asking questions from an artist's point of view is one of the most important things we can do in society, because we can ask certain things that other people can't ask or are unwilling to ask. So I want to argue tonight that there's a value in this, and to extend that a bit further, I want to argue that there's a value in artists asking questions outside of their domain, across disciplinary divides, whether we're invited in the conversation or not. I'm very stubborn about getting involved in various types of topics. But I want to argue why we should do that. And because I really think, as artists, we have a certain type of nimbleness and a particular sensitivity to our observations that I think adds texture. And I like to go a little further and even argue that there's what I like to call an artistic checks and balances to often unchecked forms of power or unquestioned ethical norms that extend across science and technology and politics. And I think the arts and humanities are really equipped to address this problem. And there's another layer to that too that I want to try to get to tonight that's implied in my title, which is that I also think we are capable of asking questions that particularly deal with forms of loss, maybe broad cultural forms of loss. I mean, we're going through one right now, of course. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So I mean, these kinds of caliber scale loss, that the types of questions artists can ask can help us as a type of broad social therapy, thinking about these things. So tonight I've designed the talk to really emphasize this role of questions. And so I'm going to put up a lot on the screen. And I do that because for me, that's as revealing to show you something about my process as any studio visit might be. So I hope this is relevant to a lot of the young artists out there who are forming their own questions right now. And how do you sustain a life of continuing to ask poignant questions? So I'll be happy at the end of this to go over that with you and maybe help you think through your own types of questions. So, I'm going to be ambitious tonight, time permitting. I want to try to cover 5 broad categories that have compelled me for over multi-decades now. I've done a lot of work in these various fields that are you see here on the screen. I'm going to try to talk about one work per topic, and we'll see how that goes. I may have to cut it a little short, but what I also want to do is highlight the research that goes into all this work. The questions are, of course, birthed from the research. And so I'm one of the artists that would proudly say they're a research-based artist, and I give that as much weight as any art object I may make in the end. And there's just one, before I start, there's just one final point that I'd love to make that I think will also help frame all of these projects. And so, as I said, obviously I'm very invested in the role of artists asking important cultural questions, especially across disciplinary divides. But this is always in the service of a deeper underlying conviction. And that conviction is this. I do believe that the ultimate function of art is to express, expand, and evolve our empathetic capabilities. So any question I ask, I let it go wherever it may for a long time. But when it gets time back to making an artwork, it has to veer back to this conviction. This is ultimately what drives me as an artist, and why I'm deeply concerned about our tendencies in our culture today to undermine our ability for certain behaviors like long-term engagement, compassion, uh, basically anything that loosens our ability to remember our common humanity, then I am going to challenge it in my work, and that's why I want to highlight this point here for you tonight. So, with that said, I'm going to jump into, I think, the biggest bird's eye view of a topic that I spend a lot of time on, and it's some of you may be aware of this burgeoning field called Neuro Aesthetics. And so, here's how big I'm implying about the questions that I like to ask. I love art. I've committed my life to it, as all of you have. But I find that, 25 years in, there are certain questions that I still don't have a good answer to. For example, biologically speaking, why are we creative at all? Evolutionarily, why did evolution sort of tend to favor this ability to have an aesthetic experience? And I'm very fascinated with these deep-rooted reasons why we are creative and aesthetically engaged people. So these questions I want to put up here to start with, and I want to tell you about a project that I've been working on for several years, kind of formed around these questions. What is an aesthetic experience? Again, it's funny, like we all have them. We all have kind of, like I said, invested our life into creating them for others as well as experiencing them. But when push comes to shove, you're probably going to struggle explaining what it actually is at the level of the brain and the mind. And that worries, it bothers me. I want to know what's going on there. And it raises this other contentious question about, can art and aesthetics even be measured and recorded in the language of science at all, which hits up against this, long conflict between the arts and sciences that I find fascinating, which I'll unwrap a bit more tonight. And then this final question, which seems like a bit of a curveball, but I'll connect all the dots in a minute. But can art heal a wound? And so I have been working with a neuroengineer, several, but this is my number one collaborator, Dr. Pepe Contreras Vidal. And Pepe and many others are in a burgeoning field of neuroprosthetics. And in a nutshell, what this means is, through this technology, many of you are probably familiar with EEG recording, which records the electrical signatures of your brain in various mental states. But basically, there is a huge advancement being made that nobody could have predicted even 20 years ago, which is that with a particular group of injured patients, paraplegics, amputees, stroke victims, various types of injuries that affect the limbs, who of course now lost their ability for basic human functions like walking or touching or grabbing a plate, for example. And so Pepe and others have done something incredible by reading the neural signatures of the brain. For example, when you go to grab a coffee cup, what that looks like at the level of neurons in the brain firing can now be recorded and in real time deciphered as intention and communicated to prosthetic limbs to allow people to walk or move again. There's this incredible video I want to show you. This is a stroke victim who has not walked in over a decade. And in real time, you can see he's thinking about walking. And that in real time is being deciphered into the prosthetic limb, the movement of the limbs. This is really incredible stuff. And I want you to, probably asking, well, what's that got to do with art? And especially the healing point. And this is where I want to try to connect the dots in an interesting way. Before I do that, I just want to show you one more really cool video, which is now itself probably 10 years old. The science has now moved on way past this, but I want to show you the level of nuance the science is allowing us to literally read minds, read intentions. And I'll play this video for you real quick.
I'm thinking of the letters of a word that only I know. Every time the computer flashes the correct letter on the screen, I silently think to myself, that's it, that's the one. That feeling of recognition sets off a unique electrical pattern in my brain, which the computer picks up.
Wow, this is remarkable.
It worked the first time I tried it, without a single mistake.
That is amazing. How about that?
So you can see we are making some incredible advancements in reading minds, a field that for decades was considered more of a pseudoscience. But this is where it gets really interesting with art and why I've invested so much of my time into it. What does it mean to record what he just did, which is to think of letters, or the previous man who thought about walking? This is sort of one tier of complexity that we can record in the brain. But what happens when we make the leap to these deeper experiences, like aesthetic experience? And this is where the science, I find, really starts to falter a bit. As you can see this very humorous image here of trying to record what's happening in the brain while somebody's playing a jazz keyboard. These experiments have been done on painters, on sculptors, on dancers, on musicians, basically trying to build an archive of what the brain is doing in these aesthetic experiences, or producing them, and as well as experiencing them. But as an artist observing this, before I continue, the reason why this is important and why I ultimately knew that I would work with Pepe was one day when I was interviewing him about all of this, I asked him ultimately what is his ultimate sign of success, and he told me something so beautiful and so poetic that I knew this was the entryway for the arts to this problem. And he basically told me that in a dark room, using a prosthetic limb, someone who hasn't, has lost their arm, for example, that if they could touch their partner in a dark room and do this to them, move their index finger across their forearm, would the person know that the distinction between a lover, a parent, a stranger, and a friend? And I want you to think about that for a second, like how miraculous it is that the brain can distinguish that level of nuance in a dark room with nothing more than a touch. That's what Pepe and others want to give back to patients who have lost this capability. But to do that, they have to make a huge leap, which is where aesthetics comes into play. Because broadly speaking, the category of aesthetic experience and art, basically, even more broadly than that, emotional experience itself, that is incredibly different than what your brain looks like when you're walking or grabbing a cup. That is an ocean divided. And the only way they think they can ever get there is if they start to study art and what's happening in the brain at the level of art. So with that in mind, I've begun a series of experiments with Pepe. And I'm going to show you some film from one of them. One of the big problems is, like with the humorousness of that image of the jazz keyboardist in the MRI, the problem is that the scientists don't they haven't quite learned how to make the distinction, as many artists, as probably all of us would immediately see the problem with recording someone in that highly constrained and contrived laboratory setting. The problem is that they don't really know how to conduct these experiments outside the laboratory. And I believe as an artist, one of the things I can allow for is access to the museum as a laboratory of this kind of data collection. And so this is a show I had, the works you're seeing are actual artworks, but accompanying the show was this large-scale experiment, still, I think to this date, the largest one ever conducted. And the key conceptual point being that these are freely behaving individuals looking at art in the context of art, not in the highly constrained conditions of a laboratory. Now, that we don't know, we have to find out, but that should look different at the level of the brain than these highly contrived situations. And so I've spent a lot of my time trying to build relationships between laboratories and museums that will enable this kind of, it's logistics essentially, as opening the door to each other. And so at this point, we've written about 5 papers together. We did the study itself. This is, again, for an artist, it's very unusual to be collaborating with scientists at this level, especially at the level of publishing papers. For 3 years now, we've hosted a huge conference that is trying to bring together experts from various fields to really dig into this problem and think about, not only for the sake of knowledge itself about what's happening in the brain at the level of an aesthetic experience, but for me, as I said earlier, what's driving me is the possibility that something I know, something about art, could enable someone to walk better or grab their partner's hand, and it means something again. If what we do as artists and all the beautiful things that we do can also do this, then I want to know. I want to know if it's possible. I don't know. We're still working on it. And we've produced a lot of information and data. And I want to show you the second part of this project. So the first part was that large-scale study. And the other thing that I noticed once I really got in there and started to understand what the scientists, how they were designing their own experiments, it occurred to me that not only, were they making these odd decisions about sticking an artist in an fMRI machine, but they also, it occurred to me, they also didn't quite know what an artist would want. Because they never thought to ask them, which is something I always find a problem across disciplines, is we don't really know how to communicate. But, did it matter to an artist to be stuck into an fMRI machine as opposed to, a comfortable Sunday morning in their studio? And it does, and it does matter. I certainly felt different when I was being treated like a lab rat than when I was just being an artist in my studio. So with that in mind, I challenged them, what if we could draw on the rich, I would argue, the rich history of art's investigation into psychology and neurology through things like the rich history of games, artistic games, Exquisite Corpse, obviously, very very obvious one, but a good place to start. So I not only sort of educated them on this long lineage of the Exquisite Corpse. I hope everybody knows this. I think you could really make the case that it's a fascinating example of artists doing a type of neuroscience way before such things would have been called that. And I wanted to know, could we produce an actual scientific experiment using the rich lineage of artistic games rather than the setup they were using in the fMRI machines? So we have been doing that. And we've been doing a number of live Exquisite Corpse studies that also are in this weird zone between performance art and actual scientific data collection. And I love that it's unclear what exactly it is that we're doing. Really thrive in that weird space. This variation you're seeing here was, to complicate it even further, it was an exquisite corpse across 3 different mediums: a dancer, a painter, and a saxophonist. And we are still in the process of working on this and gathering the data, as I said, but this is really, I hope, cutting edge stuff as far as not only advancing the science and what they're after, which is to better design these prosthetic limbs, but also for myself as an artist, I never thought I'd make a hybrid performance / laboratory experiment artwork. But it was only because I asked these odd questions that I could go down this road. Here's some images of various exquisite corpse performances we've been doing. So with that in mind, I want to tackle the next topic, and we're going to kind of make a tour through the body here tonight. I'm going to move to that other very mysterious and complicated organ, the heart. And I want to do something similar here. I want to lay out some questions for you, and I want to lay out a similar type of advancement in science that is, I would argue, highly of need for ethical and moral provocation from the arts. And there's this deep tension between the history of the heart, between the romantic poetic heart, and of course, the scientific heart, the heart as a complicated pump, rather than, the source of great poetry. And this tension is, I bring it up because I'm fascinated in the history of it, but it's also sort of the stand-in for this deeper problem between the sciences and the humanities. And so I've spent many years now investigating the history of the heart, its religious connotations, philosophical, artistic, medical, spiritual, and trying to untangle all of these competing ideas about who can claim the knowledge of the heart. But I want to tell you, or here's some of the questions I'd like you to hold in your mind as I move through this project. How does the heart determine this boundary line between life, death, and personal identity, which is exactly the history I'm talking about? Everybody's got something to say, religiously speaking, artistically, philosophically, and medically about these three things, and they don't all align at all. And so it produces quite a fascinating tension. But then in a more poetic sense, I want you to think about this other question. What do we owe to the memory of each other's hearts? That is a very different type of question than, is the heart a complicated pump? And the tension between those two questions is what I want to get at. And this final question, does love survive the death of cells? I think these two questions will make a little more sense when I dig in here. So with that brief background about the complications of the way we understand the heart culturally, I want to point out the topic I've spent the most time on, which is the history of the artificial heart. And perhaps nothing has pushed us harder on our reimagining of the heart than the day we crossed the line into putting a machine inside another human to function as a heart. This is the day it happened, a milestone event. We've kind of lost touch with it now, but this was worldwide headlines at the time. It was a shock to everybody concerned. It raised a host of new questions that don't get a lot of attention, that I have decided to spend a lot of attention on. For example, Mrs. Karp here, the spouse meeting her husband after surgery. One of the most beautiful things I've ever heard somebody ask. She asked her husband, after being the first human to be given a mechanical heart, she asked him, did he still love her? That was her first question when he came out of surgery. And although science doesn't have anywhere to put such a question, art does. And I want to argue why that's as important a question as anything else that was asked. Because Mrs. Karp got to something very profound. Like, where are we in our bodies? Where is our love, our emotions, our pride, all the courage, all the things we've associated with the heart? What happens when you remove it? And so this technology has just, snowballed over the past 50 years. All kinds of variations have come and gone. They've all suffered from a similar problem, which is we can't solve the problem. And it has really stumped many people in the field why turns out to be such a difficult engineering problem to make a heart and let it last for up to a lifetime in someone. A conceptual breakthrough has occurred with these two doctors who I've spent a lot of time with studying their work, because I want to tell you what they've done, which is a game changer in how I think we can imagine who we are as humans in the future. They did something radical. They've decided that because we can't perfectly mimic a pulsing beating heart, what if we just redesign it without pulsatility at all? And they have made one, and they implanted it in this gentleman, Mr. Craig Lewis, several years ago. And there's an x-ray of it in his body. But I want to tell you what the implications of this device are. Is Mr. Lewis was the first human in history who was a flat line on every monitor in the room. This device, you have no heartbeat, you have no pulse, and you have no EKG. He was technically dead by current standards, and yet he lived for 5 weeks with this device. I'm not gonna go over all the engineering advancements here, but the point is that it doesn't pulse. It uses little rotating blades inside to action as a type of turbine. And the side effect is something profound, which is humans, potentially a future of humans without beating hearts. And I want to parallel that with another scientist that I've spent much time with and who's doing something equally game-changing. And it's as an artist and especially as a sculptor, this is one of the most complicated and beautiful and weird objects I've ever seen in my life. It's called a ghost heart. And what Dr. Taylor is doing is, instead of using a mechanical heart, she's proposing, what if we could wash our hearts clean and, in a sense, wash all of the cells out of it. And all that's left behind is the architecture of the heart, which is why it looks like this, what you're looking at here. This is the shell, the basic shell of a heart, washed clean of all of its cells. And her idea is, if we could get the heart back down to this basic architectural state, can she then repopulate it with a patient's cells and basically build a new heart? But the key thing here is that you'd be implanting your heart back into yourself, but one that has been produced outside of your body. It's a very weird, profound thing that I think comes with its own host of ethical and moral questions. And so here you have two objects that I have been studying for years now, the ghost heart and the artificial heart, each driven, like with Pepe, driven by real humanitarian desires to heal the injured and the sick, but at what cost? And this is where I want to argue again why the arts and humanities are important. Because as much as I respect Dr. Taylor and Dr. Fraser, and these are brilliant, brilliant people who have literally saved thousands of people's lives, but they're not interested in asking the poetic questions. For example, as I've asked Dr. Fraser, nobody's fallen in love with a beatless heart. Nobody's given birth with a beatless heart. No artist has made art with a beatless heart. Nobody's worshiped to their God with a beatless heart. And for him, that's a trivial, irrelevant question because it doesn't matter to him. But what I humbly think he's forgetting is the lineage of the poetic and emotional and spiritual meaning of the heart. And at minimum, they are both suggesting new possible futures of human beings that nobody has discussed beyond themselves, in the sense that, are we okay societally? Would we be okay with the future of beatless human beings? I don't know, but it's not something anybody's asking. And what I've learned is that nobody's gonna ask it unless an artist does, or someone from the humanities. And so that has been part of this project, has been to really think about and press them on these points. I want to show you a small sculpture I made in response to this. I should tell you too that if you're interested in more of this, a lot of my work is doing public interviews with these scientists and having them engage with the arts in a public way. And so you can find various lectures online of my conversations with Dr. Taylor and Dr. Fraser. But I want to share with you this sculpture I made that's related. I love this image of the science this is way before the artificial hearts, but it's sort of science taking its first tentative steps into trying to understand the physiology of an emotional experience. And this technology birthed something that is very important to me, and I like to argue in an art historical way, that there are two images we kind of take for granted, the pulse wave and the flat line, that are not talked about art historically. I've never found any art historical analysis of them. And certainly nobody, as far as I know, has went out to try to find the very first instances of them, which is what I'm showing you here right now. This is the first time in history somebody could image someone's heart without cutting into them. And invented, I would argue, as artists, think about what we do every day. We make marks that hopefully have meaning in them. And the materials we use matter. And these, I would argue, fit this category so well. These are revolutionary images that imaged the once invisible, but they're images of, as I argued, perhaps the most complicated organ in our body because of the tension between all these disciplines competing for its meaning. And so what I wanted to do in response to the beatless heart and the ghost heart was I wanted to rewind, go back in time in history, and see if I could find the first time science crossed this road of trying to medicalize something very emotional. And in particular, I wanted to see, could I find the first time an emotional state was recorded in this new language of the waveform? A complete weird abstraction compared to the millennia of previous images of the heart. And so here it is. And it might seem, simple and trivial, but I want to try to argue to you why this image is so important. This is the first time, at least through science, through scientific tools, one could sort of prove what poets have always known, which is emotions change the heart. And I wanted, in a sense, somebody had to go first. I like to think of it. Someone's heart had to go first to show this proof in a new language. And I wanted to make a little monument to this totally forgotten anonymous day. I should point out it was not customary for the scientists to notate the names of people. So I don't know who this person was, but not unlike a monument, a tall building or a gravestone, I would argue this person, whoever they were, left behind something profound. They left behind evidence of their heart in an emotional state. And so I made this little sculpture about it. It's called Love Before There Was Love. And I took that, after years of hunting down that image, which was very difficult to find, I made it into these little monuments of that day. And they are these bronze sculptures of that two-dimensional waveform that's been made into a three-dimensional image. And it's the before and during of this emotional state. So it's a way, as I said, this is one of, a dozen sculptures that are all tackling a kind of a little different aspect of this step we're taking towards removing the humanity I'm worried about, removing the humanity from these technological advances. And one could argue it was even here in these waveforms. And I want to find a way to make it real again, to hold it in my hand. Could I hold the memory of this person's heart in an emotional state in my hand? Here are just a few more images of it. So with that in mind, the idea of a waveform as a type of signal of life, I want to tell you about this other big, you can see I'm drawn to big, complicated topics. But I want to tell you about the work I've been doing for many years in this field. And there's a parallel here with the heart and the brain. I don't know how familiar everyone is. I'll give you a brief background on this field called SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I find it to be one of the most interesting questions humans could ever ask, which is, are we alone? And it's one of those weird questions that it has to compete against the pop cultural understanding of it, alien movies and invasion and whatnot. And unfortunately, I think that does it an injustice to just how profound and complicated this question is. It's one of those rare breeds of questions where either way the answer comes out, it's a game changer. Either we are alone and that changes everything, or we're not alone and that changes everything. And why our artists and the humanities would not be invested in this topic really confounds me. Many are, but it's definitely not a hot topic or anything in the arts. But I'm fascinated by it. So the SETI Institute has been working on this problem for decades. Their task is to search for a signal of intelligent life. And like I said, I find it just brimming with fascinating, important questions to ask that the humanities have a lot to say about. And in particular, some of you may be familiar with this concept called the Fermi's paradox. And it's a really beautiful, melancholic, poetic idea, which essentially is, if there is a lot of life in the universe, then why haven't we heard from it? And that leads a lot of people to come up with various types of answers. But there's a deep melancholy to this idea that maybe we don't hear anything because there's nothing to hear. And I can't think of a deeper existential problem for the arts and humanities to think about than loneliness at the scale of the universe. And that is what these scientists think about all day. And like with the other scientists I'm interested in, I find that they're not always equipped to ask that accompanying set of emotional questions. Like, what does it mean to devote your life to something that you probably are never going to have an answer to? And that the answer may be an incredibly depressing one, which is that we're alone. But there are other questions that come out of it too, which wanted to show you here, that really concern me in my own work. So the biggest contentious debate in this field is not only, maybe it's okay to listen, but should we actively signal back? Should we take the lead and make evidence of ourselves known? This is a very complicated, contentious debate. I have my own opinions. I'll be happy to dig into it later if you like. But as an artist, I'm also really curious, when I've interviewed them, when I ask them this question, let's say we got a signal tomorrow and we have an answer to this profound question. We're not alone. Life is not unique to planet Earth. What would you say back? That now shifts, I would argue, into the arts and humanities. They are incredibly skilled and equipped to talk about how to search, but as soon as you bring up the topic of what to say back, something always comes up, which makes a lot of sense, which is that we should send math or physics. And to date, there are a handful of efforts to send messages to space. I've done a lot of work on all of these three examples here, which I won't spend too much time on, except that I want to frame, the role of the arts on this topic in this way, that in kind of a provocative way, I've asked them, like, okay, let's agree that sending math is the correct, maybe not poetic response, but a good one, because maybe physics and math is a common denominator of all intelligent life, if they're understanding the cosmos at all. But would they let an artist pick which equation to send? That gets really weird and complicated to ask, but it's a way of me trying to poke around to find a way to unite our skill sets on a common problem. And then further, in what form can math and physics be represented? Does it have to be, as a visual equation on paper, which would of course make no sense to another species that perhaps doesn't even share our same sensory experiences? And this other beautiful question about thinking about what could we reasonably assume are shared sensory experiences. So I want to show you a sculpture I made. It's a part of a series of sculptures, 6 in total. I'm just going to show you one of my proposals. There are a series of proposals I'm thinking through of what I would send. What would be the initial act of gift exchange? And I say that very specifically because it is framed to me as gift exchange, and I want it to be understood as gift. As I said earlier, this topic has to deal with, pop cultural fears of invasion and aggression. And it seems as if unfortunately, on this topic, our cultural consciousness is largely filtered through our generals and our military. And I find that so weird and annoying because, well, what if you put one of our artists in front of the problem? Anyway, the point is, it doesn't have to always be our generals. And I want to propose some ideas. So I showed this image of the spiral because I'm very fond of seashells. I've done a lot of work with seashells for various reasons. As it relates to SETI, here's a beautiful example of how math is represented in sculptural form. In particular, the nautilus shell, and many of you may be familiar with the golden ratio, and also what's known as the marvelous spiral. But there's this incredible thing everywhere we look, from big to small. Nature tends to want to organize itself around a particular equation. It just tends to do that. The way rose petals open up, all the way to the way galaxies or hurricanes form. And so I'm skipping over a bit here, but I want to show you images of this one work that utilize a lot of my ideas about materials and how math and physics can be embedded in those materials. And making a series, as I said, a series of these gift proposals. I'm going to just show you images of this one, and I'll wrap up with the next one, because I want to tell you one other point about the color. The colors in these works are very important to me as well. And so looking at our time, I'll probably have to end on this piece. But here's another way of thinking about a common denominator. Let's say math and physics is a great place to start. But what about color? And so it turns out a really beautiful thing is that, and it's a pretty recent discovery, but it turns out that the oldest cyanobacteria fossils we've been able to locate, some of the earliest forms of life to originate on our planet, it wasn't chloroform yet. It was processing in a very different way, which did not produce photosynthesis. It produced pink. And it's very likely that because these cyanobacteria dominated the planet, it's very likely that if something had been looking at planet Earth all those years ago, it would have been a pink planet. And it's very likely that our oceans had a very rosy or pink hue to them as the life spread across the planet. And of course, that image of the Earth is now on its way out, has been traveling outward for billions of years, if something had been looking. And for all they may know, we're a pink planet. But it's also something else interesting, is that maybe all life everywhere starts out pink. It changes over time into other colors, but maybe there's some common denominator about pink. And so I wanted to make this sculpture called, I'm going to skip over that slide, this Elegies of Proxima B. Proxima B is a planet we've recently discovered that is maybe a candidate for some life on it. I mean, nobody's confirmed that, but it seems like it probably has an ocean on it. We can't image it well enough yet to know if there's any life on it, of course, but maybe there's a way to begin this conversation through color and handing over a gift of our own understanding that in all of our differences, maybe we have something in common at this level. So this sculpture, I haven't spent much time tonight talking about the craft of everything that I do. I'd be happy to dig into that in the Q&A. But I'll just quickly say that all these works are made by hand. It's very important to me to craft these things myself, especially when I contextualize them as gifts. I really want, if I could hand this off one day to another life form, I want them to know it was all made especially for them. And so you're seeing a variety of techniques here, polished and cut seashells, cut paper, a number of other craft traditions as well. I'll just show you a few more details of them. But Jeffrey, I think I'll decide to, because we have about 5 minutes left, I think I'll decide to pause there and give that time over to some Q&A, and let the other works, what they were going to be, let's linger in your mind.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you. Thank you for all that.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. I wish we had all the time tonight to delve into it all. So if anyone has any questions for Dario to get the Q&A going, feel free to raise your hand. Or Dario, maybe would you prefer people put questions in the chat, or I see some hands up here. Okay.
Yeah, I think the hands will be the best solution.
Okay.
Okay. So
yeah, go ahead. So Francesca.
So what is your professional background? Like, what degree did you get in college?
Oh, that's a great question, Francesca. I actually began as a biology major. Art came to me later in life. I was always artistic, but it never occurred to me that I'd be an artist at all. It was a shock to my system. But when I made that leap into the arts, it never occurred to me to let go of my other passions, especially science, which is probably obvious in my talk tonight. So I have a strong background in science, but which I think positions me better to make these types of arguments, because I can kind of see both sides. I can see where explanations break down across disciplines, where suspicions arise. I'm very sensitive to the cliches we hold for each other, because I think we're, unfortunately losing out on some really great conversations if we can't get past those barriers. But to answer you, I began as a biology major, switched to art. Technically, I graduated as a painter. I didn't go to grad school, and I've never made a painting since, which I find very humorous. But I always like to say that I needed to know that I wasn't a painter, and it took several years to figure that out. But thank you, Francesca.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So how about John next?
One a good discussion, but seriously, that's it. Yeah, you're starting to get good.
Well, I'm being sensitive to time. I had a lot more to go, but we'll make this Q&A exciting. How's that?
Yeah, and just to note, guys, Dario does have a lot of lectures out there, so take a dive online. You can find some great things. So how about Neil? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong.
It's novel, but it's fine. In my case, from one of your earlier topics you were just discussing on neuroscience, where people view art, have you had any results where there were people who weren't interested in art at all? Like, has there been someone who had a very big distaste for art, and yet he saw a different result from everyone else?
I think, no, I didn't hear. I don't know if I heard you all, but I think you're asking for people who were not interested in art, did that show up as its own sort of neural signature?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so there you go. So that is a great question that an artist would ask. And what I find is that wasn't being asked, because there was a general consensus that, aesthetic experience is an aesthetic experience. Like, there was no nuance between, obviously, the distinction you just made between completely uninterested that never rises to aesthetic experience, to something profound like, having an epiphany in front of a painting or an artwork. But then what about things like observing a beautiful sunset? Or a flower? My point is that there are all these nuanced shades of aesthetic experience that you and I just inherently already grasp. But the science of this field has yet to sort of grasp that. It's just sort of art or aesthetic. And, instead of, getting grumpy about that with them, what I want to do in my work is to have that conversation, because this is the case to be made why artists should be involved in this field in particular, because the questions the scientists are asking, although they think they're asking the right question, And in some broad level, they are. But if they actually want to get where they want to go, even at the level of the nuance of the prosthetic limb, they're going to need way more refinement. And we're all sitting on that information. Like any of us could critique them in a profound way that would have a direct result on their experiments. So, but I guess to answer you specifically, that's why we have to do the test, because it's assumed there would be a difference, but we don't know. And that is what the work is now about: is the equipment sensitive enough to record the distinction you just pointed out? It's not clear that it is, but that's also why I'm trying to do this work, so we can figure out how to get there.
Okay, Stacy, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes, hi. Just gonna give you an idea. I love art, and I'm very into the whole idea of space exploration. It's actually a topic that's been brought up a lot in my family. My question has to do with the whole subject having to do with math when it comes to the space exploration. What would happen if, say, someone wasn't very good at math? Would it cause a problem when sending a message, especially if math is not one of your best subjects?
That's a great question. As it stands now, I think anyone who'd be in the position to respond, because that's still largely controlled by government level institutions, which have all the top scientists who would decide such things. So for example, I put up an image of 3 messages that to date have been sent to space. And I've studied them extensively, and I can promise you the math that got on board was very well vetted by top people at the time. But you know what? You raise an interesting point that I think within this century is a really interesting problem, which is, like everything else, the democratization of this problem. As the technology becomes more affordable, more citizen scientists are getting involved. Basically, the idea that the government would be the only ones controlling what messages left our planet, that will be a long dormant idea in maybe a few decades. Meaning that, a backyard astronomer could just, hey, I want to send my math homework out to space today. And, it raises really interesting, weird questions about what face do we want to put forward? Is it a one of the best of us, like our common humanity, the level of intelligence that we possess? Or is it like the messiness of the internet and just everything goes out and it's cats and whatever that are sort of the symbol of high technology for what we are about? That's a real possibility in the future that I think a lot about. And so I'm not a control freak and think that, we have to stop that. What I'm always advocating for is, as I hope I've hammered home to everyone tonight, is that we should be involved, at minimum, the artists. And when those conversations tend to occur, artists don't tend to get invited. And, I've just, through sheer stubbornness, have figured out how to get in on those conversations. And I'm always fighting to get more artists at the table. And not just artists, but our best linguists, our best historians, whatever. Name the expertise, and we should have them there. So anyway, I hope that kind of answered you. There's an interesting development around the road to what you're asking.
It did, and if anything, it definitely put a big smile on my face, and it made me think about especially all the accomplishments they've been doing right now in space as well.
Right. I mean, there's a great example. The space is becoming privatized. Like, it's not NASA that will be controlling everything in the future. So it's something that we have to contend with as a society. Is Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and whatever they're about, is that what we want facing forward for what is the best of humanity? Maybe it is. I don't know. But like with the Beatless Heart or Neuro Aesthetics, I want to find a way to have the conversation more broad conversation, but with the arts involved, because of the questions we will ask. So anyway, thank you, Stacy.
Okay, Guyan, do you want to hop in?
Are you? It's pronounced Gahan, but I go by Laura. So, personal question: if you were the one, if we have received a signal from outside of Earth, possibly, contacting living beings that we don't know of, if you were the one chosen to respond to them, what would you say?
Well, it's a great, beautiful question, and why, there's me personally, and then more broadly, why I think arts should be involved. That's the piece I mentioned. If we were going to pick math, which I don't disagree is a good idea, but as I was saying, but can we do something more with it? Can it also mean something, like in the way an artist would want it to mean? So can it both display a certain intelligence level of our planet, like the golden equation or the golden ratio, while at the same time that equation doing something extra, which is it's highly likely that whatever this other being's body is made of, it's highly likely that with all our differences, it's probably organized around the same system, because we see it everywhere we look. It's all over nature. There's this tendency to organize matter along this spiral idea. So that's one idea, is how can I show that as an object? And I pick seashells. The other idea was with color. Could we show that we share a similar color in the origins of life on our planet? My point is that I have a checklist of things. But for me, it's about what do we have in common, not what do we have our differences. Because it really does concern me that, as I said, this conversation's largely hijacked by fear. And, some people, if you allow me to go in just one second, one thing that I often get asked about is, this is a fun topic and it's interesting conceptually, but what does it matter today, on the ground, so to speak? And what I always like to argue is that part of my job as an artist in my intro, as I said, was to evolve and express empathy. And anything I can do to further refine my capabilities of doing that, I will do it. And I want to argue to everyone tonight that thinking about life off our planet, even though it seems fantastical and maybe a luxury, but it's not. It's an incredible way to fine-tune your skills about how we other things, other people, other things. Aliens are the ultimate example of the other. They can literally, we don't even know if they're there, so we can just project every possible fear onto them. And so when I see us do that as a culture, I see a case study, an example of our tendency to see fear in the unknown. And I want to challenge myself on this problem and think about how do I combat that? What's the common denominator that will allow for communication, not fear, in those early initial steps? So things like the seashells as math, things like what role does color play in the origins of life? Like I said, I have a long list of such things. But they're always dictated by this counter to fear.
So basically, you're saying that you would ask them something for a connection, something that is based on not fear, but more like, what's the word? Something that, well, like I said, connection.
Yeah, connection's a good word. Yeah, connection's a good word. Yeah, and in this case, I'm rather than, there's the case of, do we respond? Let's say we got a message tomorrow and we need to respond, or do we proactively send the message first? Are we the ones messaging? And the distinction is interesting because I think it allows you to think about different strategies about, given any possibility, what would we say tomorrow? Even without confirmation if anything's out there. And so that's sort of the one that I like the most, because I like that there's this blank slate, and as I said, it forces me, it doesn't force me, I want to. I want to think about what do we have in common, because it's an extinction, it's an extension of doing the same thing to fellow humans right now. You know, all of us gathered in this space, we have wonderful differences. They don't need to rise to fear. We can find what's in common to have a conversation. That's also an incredible human skill. And unfortunately, you know, like I said, it tends to be our generals or military that want to take over on this problem as displaying something about our humanity. And I'm not willing to let that be the only discussion.
Well, thank you so much for answering my question.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
All right, Enoch, do you have your question?
Yeah, I was I was just one thinking about the love thing, the love sculpture, and how do you think that that kind of art can also be applied to like mental health in the future, say people with like anxiety and depression, and studying the way their brain like waves?
Yes, so I highlighted the prosthetics issue as far as something I'm personally interested in, but this research has benefits for all the things you just said. Another topic I spend a great deal of time on is art and Alzheimer's in particular. You know, what does science say about the value of, let's say, memory retention for Alzheimer's or dementia patients who are actively taken to museums? There's really, really good science that says this works. Like there's great evidence that says this does something profound about memory. On the point of depression and anxiety, there is a lot of literature on that as well. You could, if you dug around, you could find it. I can't immediately think of the papers' names, but all that to say that the research is being done as pure neuroscience, but the extra layer that I'm arguing tonight is, but what if the arts add in their 2 cents on this? And so, for example, with Alzheimer's patients, the value of using the museum as a type of laboratory setting to conduct these experiments is proving very fruitful. So my answer is that it is already happening on the 2 topics you specifically said. And I think we're going to have incredible results in the future. And I want the arts to be involved. Sound like a broken record on that.
Okay. Thanks. Good question, Enoch. Rena, do you have your question?
Yes. More specifically with English and creative writing, how do you incorporate those 2 topics within your works? Especially with the artificial heart, it reminded me of Mary Shelley with Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about that.
It's a great, deep question, because there are two ways I could answer. One, the role of literature and writing in my own work is quite significant. It's so significant that I do something a bit odd, I think, to most object makers, which is I never make the sculpture until I have the title. And not even the title, but the material list. If you have a chance to look at any of my work, if you look at the title and the material list, I'll just make a note to you that came first, before I knew what I was going to make. And I have a term I like to use called materialist poet. And it's a term I thought a lot about, trying to describe what it is that I do exactly. And it's important to me because it's not quite synesthesia. I don't think it's that category of an experience, but it's close. It's somehow adjacent, in the sense that I understand materials and texture and contour through language. Like I can understand how to make a sculpture once I figured out the language of it. So it's kind of a backward way, usually the title and text come after you make the object, but for me it comes first. the Mary Shelley thing is a great connection, and I have a quick thing to say about that. A topic I didn't bring up tonight, another category that I spend a lot of time on, is called synthetic biology. And this is the field, you may know it, but it's the field largely that, like the beatless heart, it's going to change the world. If we have a future of designer babies, it will be because of synthetic biology. The COVID vaccines were largely made and at such pace because of synthetic biology technologies, is going to change the world, because we can now control our DNA in a way that evolution has never known. The reason I bring that up is because when I often talk to those scientists, I like to point out to them and as I said, they're often not ethically engaged. It's not that they don't care, it's just they don't think it's their problem, or they're not trained to think about, what if I make the science that incorporates an era of designer babies? What's the societal consequence of that is not something they get in their training. But what I like to point out is I always bring up Frankenstein. And I bring it up because I like to say that think of the enduring impact that Mary Shelley, an artist, has had on multiple generations in how we understand science. And as much as I love that, and I love that book, it's an incredible work of art. And she's doing it. She's doing something that I hope I'm part of a lineage of, which is she was critical. She asked profound questions about the fears of her time. And at her time, scientists were making corpses move by electrifying them. This caused scandals at the time, not unlike the beatless heart and synthetic biology today. Anyway, my point is that she wrote something that has lasted for over a century and has dictated, whether the scientists agreed or not, it dictated the conversation for a certain type of, mad scientist, of science run amok. And I think that's good, but also I asked the scientist, do you want to hand over the narrative of your work in this way? Would you rather not collaborate? Or do you disagree? Or do you want to be more ethically minded by engaging with literature like that? So Mary Shelley is a great example for all these topics tonight. Anyway, thanks for asking that question.
Okay, guys, we're going to wrap it up here. Catherine, do you have a question, or do we get to yours already?
I do have a question.
Okay, this will be the last question. Just so
I agree. My battery's running low. I'm sorry if I get cut off. Go ahead, Catherine.
Okay. So not to exhaust you on the topic of searching for life in the universe, but in the interest of thinking about what you would send out, in terms of like the medium you would you choose something that is visual, something that is auditorial, like a sound, or would you choose something textural? And how would you, account for the fact that whatever you are trying to communicate with may not receive information the same way that we do?
I love the question. And again, this is a question an artist would ask. Because as of right now, that conversation for scientists is all about radio waves or light. That's the medium of choice to communicate. It makes a lot of sense. If you're traveling that far, it makes sense to go ahead and travel at the speed of light. But there's something to be said for sending an object. And that's why I showed on the screen something called the Golden Record, which I've spent years, that's what I'm writing my book about, is largely about the Golden Record. And the case for sending an object, I think, is so compelling not instead of, but in addition to light waves, like through radio communication. Because you open the door to all kinds of other sensorial experiences as you're getting at. And, I can go on and on about what I think that should be, but then you got to the other heart of it, which is what really frames this problem, makes it so difficult, which is, what if you can't imagine the thing you're giving it to? Like you can't assume anything, no shared experience. And that's another example to me of a wonderful test case of, well, just using reason, like what's reasonable, since we can't have confirmation. what's a reasonable assessment of a common sensorial experience? That's why I went to color. You know, it seems like on planet Earth, eyes have independently evolved several times. We have examples on our planet where given evolution and a random assortment of materials, life tends to want to make eyes. There's a real advantage to seeing things in various waveforms. So it's no guarantee, but I also think it's a reasonable assessment that an intelligent life elsewhere has some sort of visual apparatus. And if that's true, then, you know, it could open the door to fun speculation about color and other things, which is where I went with that piece. But I love the question because you're getting to the heart of how difficult it is, but also how fun it is. It's just fun to think about giving a gift to something you can't imagine. And because it gives you an opportunity to be your best again, to think about what's in common with each other. And what would you want to give? And what efforts would you make to overcome your differences? So that's why I love it. I love it as an exercise to think about. So anyway, I hope I answered somewhat of your question, Catherine.
You did. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
Hey, great questions, everyone. I think Dario's given us a lot to think about. Reminder, everyone that's in the class, you know, dive deep on this. He's got a lot of information out there. His website's a great resource. I put some links on our Mason Exhibitions page, just as a reminder. So thanks again, Dario. Do you have any final thoughts or statements you want to share? Or
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for being here. I know you could do other things tonight, and I appreciate you being here. And hopefully I'll get to visit your school someday.
We would love to have you. All right. Well, thank you all, and good night now.
Okay. Bye, everyone. See you, Jeffrey.